Bon vespre, muy buenas tardes. Soy Pablo Pérez II, director de esta sede de la Fundación Juan Marc en Palma, a la cual les doy la bienvenida. Un saludo muy especial también para todas las personas que nos están viendo en directo a través de Canal Marc y YouTube. Un saludo también para nuestros amigos de The Art Society que están hoy aquí. Y bueno, como saben, la sesión de hoy va a ser en inglés. Les ofrecemos a título orientativo una traducción simultánea que aparecerá en la parte de arriba de la pantalla. Como ven, es una herramienta que no es todavía perfecta, pero les puede ayudar a seguir nuestra conversación de hoy. Así que bueno, me cambio al inglés. Good evening and welcome to the Palma branch of Fundación Juan Marc, where we are thrilled to offer you the third in our series of 4 lectures focusing on golden ages in the history of Sicily. Our distinguished speaker this evening is Professor David Abulafia. Good evening, David, and thanks for kindly accepting our invitation. It's a great pleasure to have you here again. David Abulafia is a leading British historian known for his contributions to Mediterranean and maritime history, especially in the Middle Ages and the modern period. He has taught at several academic institutions, developing most of his activity as a teacher and researcher at the University of Cambridge, where he is a fellow of Gonville and Keyes College. And he has been Emeritus Professor of Mediterranean History. David is the author of numerous books, among which we should mention Frederick II, a Medieval Emperor, a topic that is very close to his lecture this evening, and also his most recent, The Boundless Sea, A Human History of the Oceans. He is a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London, a Fellow of the Royal Society of History, and also a Fellow of the British Academy. So please join me in welcoming Professor David Abulafia.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was here last year to talk about the Mediterranean, and now I am reverting to the subject with which I began my historical research a good many years ago, which is the Norman Kingdom of Sicily and its continuation in the 13th century under Emperor Frederick II. So let's begin. So let's begin with a map of the Mediterranean, because the point I really want to make is a very simple one, which perhaps has been made already in previous lectures, and that is the central position, the central strategic position of Sicily within the Mediterranean. The fact that it commands access from the Western Mediterranean through to the Eastern Mediterranean and from Europe to Africa. So the history of Sicily, particularly in the medieval period, is very much bound up with these interactions. And when we think about Norman adventurers coming all the way down from Northern Europe, from France, right down to southern Italy and Sicily, when we think of the people they displaced as rulers of Sicily, who were Berbers from North Africa, we can see how these interactions took place on a truly, you could almost say, global scale. But as I'll say in a moment, one particular feature of this was also the role of Sicily in the trade routes. Before that, I just want to produce, I want to show you a detailed map of Sicily. Not because I want to take you into any of these towns. What I want to do is to give you some idea of the ethnic and religious distribution of the population in medieval Sicily, by which I mean the 11th, 12th, well, 13th century, as you'll hear, is a bit different, but let's say the 11th and 12th centuries. Because this was an island which, having been conquered by the Muslims from North Africa in the 9th century, that had as one of its results a very significant migration of Arabs and Berbers into the island. but the previous population, to some extent, to a large extent, still existed. And that population had been predominantly Greek-speaking because the island had been under the rule of the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople. So we have a very interesting demographic distribution which tended to see the Muslims living in the west and southeast of the island, and the Christian Greeks living more in the area around Mount Etna, which you can see in the corner there. And that sort of distinction was quite important because it meant that some of the cities in the western part of the island, like Palermo, tended to be dominated by the Muslim population. It became a very important city. It became the capital of Muslim Sicily. But then on the other side, around Messina, you had, in the 12th century, you had a predominantly Greek population. And so one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is what sort of degree of cooperation existed between these different ethnic groups, and to what extent the arrival of the Normans from the north changed this position. To these groups, we also have to add one other group, which was the Jewish population, which was quite significant. So under Muslim rule, what we find is the Jews and the Christians had to pay a special tax, a poll tax, which exempted them from military service, but it also involved certain disabilities so that their religious buildings couldn't be too prominent. There were sometimes rules about costume, which nobody paid much attention to. There were sometimes rules about who had to ride on a donkey rather than a horse. Again, did people pay any attention to that? In the countryside, you had this very mixed population, again, more Muslims in the west and more Greeks in the east. And then, with the arrival of the Normans, and I'll say a little bit about how that occurred, but with the arrival of the Normans, what we find is the arrival of a third religious element, and I'll call them Catholics. Historians would tend to say Latin Christians. Well, let's call them Catholics for the moment, who came not merely from Normandy, but actually in larger numbers, came during the late 11th and 12th centuries, and particularly into the northeast of Sicily, the so-called Lombardi, Lombards, i.e. North Italians, many of them coming from the area, the hinterland behind Genoa in the northwest of Italy. So a further element was introduced, which was of the same religious identity as the Norman rulers. So we need to ask ourselves how that changed the situation on the ground. And so one of my big themes today is very much this theme of to what extent these populations actually did create well, to use the term that one encounters in Spanish history, convivencia, living together. Do we see something similar in Sicily in this period to what we see in Spain, by and large in a slightly earlier period? Right, so, this is just a rather interesting discovery from the 11th century in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, part of an atlas of the world that included Sicily, and it does include the important towns and so on. It's therefore it's from the late Arab period, around the time of the Norman conquest at the end of the 11th century. And it's very, very schematic, but it's being a fairly recent discovery, I couldn't resist including it. But what I actually want to move on to is something I alluded to earlier, which is the importance of Sicily. There's another group of people from outside who came to Sicily, or several other groups of people from outside who came regularly to Sicily, and that was the merchants, because of this extraordinary situation that Sicily had within the Mediterranean, but also because of what Sicily itself had to offer. It was one of the great breadbaskets of the ancient and medieval world, and indeed the modern world thereafter. And it produced this particular type of wheat, hard wheat, which is the sort of wheat with a high gluten content, which keeps extremely well. It's quite dry and therefore ideal for the making of pasta. So I don't believe that Marco Polo introduced pasta to Italy and Europe. It was there already, and it was certainly being produced in Sicily in this period, along with all sorts of other grain-based products. And alongside that, we have various plants which were introduced under Arab rule but remained important one way and another subsequently. And the most important of those really was cotton. Cotton which was exported in large quantities around the Mediterranean. A particular source of cotton actually was an island we don't think of as part of Sicily nowadays, but was regarded as part of Sicily in this period, the island of Malta. Right, so what about this map? This map shows the merchants, where the merchants of Genoa and Venice travelled. It's all very approximate because you could add all sorts of routes that the map maker sort of forgot about or ignored. But the important thing is that these Genoese and Venetians, they themselves were simply slotting into a commercial network which had already existed for several centuries. The major focus of this commercial network in Sicily during the 10th and 11th centuries was a group of merchants from Cairo. We know a lot about them because their documents have been preserved mainly in Cambridge, in fact, and they were Jewish merchants who ranged not just across the Mediterranean and had very intense business in Palermo, in silk and other products of that sort, but even into the Indian Ocean. So the other end of their trade routes extended as far as the coast of India, in fact. Spices, things like that. But they were eventually displaced by the Venetians and the Genoese, who became the major exporters of the grain and things like this, but also began to settle in the towns during the Norman period. So that was a further element, a very important element in the cities during the 12th century. Oh dear. Sorry, I will get there. Yeah. But I'm anticipating a bit, because what you really want to know at this stage, who are these Normans? And the term Norman, of course, it has, particularly for English speakers, it has a particular resonance because it's used to refer to the rulers of England from 1066 onwards, King William the Conqueror and so on. Now, the Normans who conquered southern Italy, they came from Normandy. They were, like William the Conqueror, ultimately of Scandinavian or Norse descent, but they were not related to the ruling dynasty of England, with which actually for a long time they had very, very little contact. They were freebooters, they were mercenaries, and their target was, in the first place, the south of Italy. Sicily came later in their conquests. But we call them Normans, which is, I say, confusing because in Spanish and Italian and other languages, the term Normandos, Normanni, etc., is often used for the Vikings as well. And it's a reminder that they were ultimately of Scandinavian descent. There is a story in an Icelandic history book written in the 14th century of one of the Norwegian kings early in the 12th century visiting the Norman Count of Sicily, Roger II, who eventually became king of Sicily, and giving him a crown because of his Scandinavian ancestry. It seems a bit mythological. I don't think Roger really knew much about his Scandinavian ancestry. I'm not even clear that because he was a second generation Norman, that his French probably wasn't very good. He probably spoke his mother's language, which was the Italian of northwestern Italy. All right, so these Normans from the beginning of the 11th century had been intruding as mercenaries, supporting either side, the Byzantines, the so-called Lombards, who ruled a number of principalities in the south of Italy. You can see Amalfi there, you can see If you look carefully, you can see Salerno and so on. And the Normans eventually, it's the old story, a bit like the Anglo-Saxon conquest of England, the people invited in as mercenaries eventually take over. So they established themselves in southern Italy, where there was both this Lombard Catholic population and also a Greek population, particularly on the eastern side, which inflamed their relationship with the Byzantine emperors. And this was a problem also, as we'll see later on. But Sicily, they got drawn into Sicily, the same sort of story as I mentioned with the Anglo-Saxons being invited in by the ancient Britons and then taking over. In Sicily, they were invited in the 1060s by one of the emirs. There was rivalry among the Muslim emirs of Sicily, and lo and behold, they came in and they took over stage by stage. It took them about 30 years, actually, to establish their domination over the whole of the island. So it's a very slow process, and they were a small minority. But the kings, the counts, later on from 1130, kings of Sicily, made an important decision. On the mainland, all these Norman knights had been granted bits of land and so on, estates. And the result of that was continuing tension on the mainland. On the island, they were careful to keep a great deal of the island under their direct control. And when you think about the resources of the island, the wheat and the cotton and so on, this actually gave them a very secure fiscal base, which made them into really the richest rulers in Western Europe by the middle of the 12th century. And it also enabled them to take advantage of the chaos in that area of southern Italy and to move in, and under Roger II, the second Count of Sicily of that name, so early in the 12th century, he managed to gain control of all the South Italian territories as well. And as a result of, how could one put it, getting sucked into conflicts between two rival candidates for the papacy, he managed to get a crown out of both of them. The first one, who was very much on his side, but who was defeated, and then he managed himself to defeat the second one and managed to secure confirmation of his right to a crown. So from 1130, we're dealing with a kingdom of Sicily and southern Italy, but I'm going to be concentrating mainly on Sicily. Right, so, sorry about this. Yeah. So Roger II, this very remarkable figure, when he became king, he surrounded himself with advisors who, some of them were Greeks from the mainland. His father had used a lot of these in setting up the administration. There were some Arabs as well, and there were even English people who turned up in Sicily and worked for King Roger. He was a patron of all, any talented administrator was welcome at his court. Well, one of the people at his court was a priest called Grisandus, and Grisandus had a mother called Anna, and when Anna died, Grisandus had a memorial stone, a sort of gravestone, if you like. I'm not sure it was actually put over her tomb, but near her tomb, created for her in the 1140s. So Roger had been on the throne by then for a dozen years or so. And what is really interesting about this, and the reason historians point to this very consistently, is that it's in 4 different scripts. I said scripts, I didn't say languages. So of course we've got Latin because Grisandus was a priest in the royal chapel, which I'll show you pictures of, and that meant that, of course, Latin was one of the languages he was particularly familiar with. But King Roger extended his patronage also to the Greek Orthodox Church. So we have an inscription in saying much the same sort of thing about Anna, which is in Greek. And then below we have an inscription which is in Arabic. Now, this may seem rather extraordinary that, after all, the woman who died was a Christian and it was a priest who was putting this up. But it doesn't necessarily show a particular sort of friendliness towards Islam. What we do know is that in the Palatine Chapel, and one or two books actually survive to prove this, there were religious services, Catholic religious services, conducted in Arabic in the hope of converting members of the Muslim population of Sicily. So no surprise that that is there. We're even told in a chronicle that Roger II offered money to Muslims and Jews if they would convert. It's not perhaps the most sort of the best way of convincing somebody to change religion, is it really? But anyway. And then at the top we have something really extraordinary. We have, it looks like Hebrew, but in fact it is it's Arabic in Hebrew script, because, as I say, the king was also interested in converting the Jewish population. And the Jews in Sicily continued to use Arabic as their daily language until, let's say, about 1400. And even when they were expelled in 1492 to 3, some of them were still using the Arabic language. It became their distinctive feature, really, a way of maintaining their distinctive identity. So is this a sign of multiculturalism, toleration? Historians are divided on this, but it's an important survival from this period. Another document, if you like, is the magnificent Palatine Chapel in Palermo. And this is often cited as evidence for the coming together of different religious groups. So what do we have? We have mosaics in the Byzantine style, in the Greek style. There's really nothing like this that survived in Constantinople, in Istanbul today. So these are probably among the very best examples of Byzantine mosaics, done at a time when the relationship between the King of Sicily and the Byzantine Emperor was, just for the moment, not too bad. They usually had extremely hostile relations with one another, fought wars against one another and so on. But there were moments when things were a bit better, when manuscripts arrived from Constantinople with texts of Plato and so on. So we have Byzantine mosaics. The ground plan, however, is that of a Catholic church, not of a Greek church. And even more interestingly, we have, if I just go on a bit, sorry, we have in the ceiling, we have a wooden ceiling which is decorated with the work of Arab artists. Here's an image of the king, King Roger perhaps, but I'll just go back. You can see the ceiling there. From the ground, it's almost invisible. If you go to Palermo, I advise you to try and find out when there's a wedding, because it's the only time they turn on the lights. And you can actually see something. So you creep in pretending you're a guest. So you have to dress quite well. I've done it. It works. Right, so is this, as it's often been seen, a sign of coexistence? It raises a very interesting question, which is when, as you see, for instance, in Venice, when people adopt themes from Islamic or some other artistic style, do they actually connect it with a particular culture, religion? What is it? Or is it simply that they find it aesthetically pleasing, full stop? It's a very interesting problem. All right. Now, here is Roger II, and this is a mosaic from another church, a smaller church, which was built by his admiral. I'll come to him in a minute. And this is a really important image. This is about on the screen, it's about the size of the real thing. And most of the mosaics in the church have disappeared, but fortunately this and one other are still there. And it shows King Roger being crowned by Christ. Now, the person who built the church came from Antioch, so he was a Greek Christian. So perhaps it's not surprising that the inscription is in Greek. but the word rex is actually written in Greek characters, but of course it's a Latin word meaning king. What is really striking is this was done around 1143. Now, what I didn't say is that the King of Sicily, in order to establish his claim to a throne, had to promise the Pope that he would become the Pope's vassal, that he would pay tribute to the Pope. He would have an overlord. He wasn't going to be completely sovereign, if you like. But what this shows is something rather different, and it probably dates to a period when, once again, Roger II and the Pope were on rather bad terms. So here we have God crowning the king without a papal intermediary. But look how the king is dressed. He's also dressed as a Byzantine emperor. Now, there is some debate about whether those cross-like things are fleur-de-lis, which could refer to his French ancestry, or they could be crosses. We don't know. I mean, by the time these things have been restored any number of times, a lot of the detail gets lost. But notice also something art historians have pointed to is the fairly close similarity of the two faces of Christ and the King. So he is the mirror image of the King. And here, just for comparison, we have one of his contemporaries, John Komnenos, the Byzantine emperor, and you can see the same sort of dress to something. I mean, the crown, notice the crown. We'll be coming back to the crown. There's the empress as well. So these are Byzantine motifs, but taken even further than you would expect to find in Constantinople. And as I say, there's also this image of him as or a king anyway, but dressed as a Muslim sultan. And I think what it points to is a situation where what Roger and his successors were trying to do was to display their kingly role in the language that their different subjects understood. So his Muslim subjects would understand this sort of sense of him as a sort of sultan, even though he was a Christian. I'll come back to that. And his Greek subjects would see him as a substitute, as the equal of the great emperor, the Roman emperor in Constantinople. And his Latin subjects, well, we'll come to that in a minute. Before we come quite to that, I want to show you this extraordinary object, which is a lot larger. It's probably about the size of the screen, actually. And it's preserved in Vienna, made in 1133-4. And it became, as we will hear, the coronation mantle of the Holy Roman Emperors. But it was made for Roger II. And it was probably some sort of coronation mantle or worn on very grand occasions. People have speculated that the lion or tiger, it can't really be a tiger, it must be the lion pouncing on the camel is a representation of Christendom conquering Islam. Well, that's rather speculative. But around the edge, you can see a very long inscription. So let me translate it for you. This mantle belongs to the articles worked in the royal workshop in which fortune and honor, prosperity and perfection, merit and distinction have their home. May the king rejoice in good acceptance, thriving magnificently, in great generosity and high splendor, renown and magnificence, and the fulfillment of wishes and hopes. May his days and nights be spent in enjoyment without end in change, in the feeling of honor, dependency, and active participation in happiness and in the maintenance of well-being, support, and suitable activity in the capital of Sicily in the year 528. That's in the Muslim calendar, so 1133-4. So all of that is crowded into the border of the mantle. So what we have is, though we knew about this from other sources, evidence that there was a silk workshop actually in the royal palace, and the production of silk for the king was an exceptionally important activity, which the king could easily afford because, as I say, he was very well endowed with revenue from grain and other sources. But we have, I mean, this is really quite extraordinary. In Vienna, along with his mantle, we have his other coronation. Well, I say coronation, I mean his robes worn on grand occasions. And this is a dalmatic which is a piece of Western ecclesiastical clothing. So what I said was, if you remember, Roger and his successors, they want to present themselves to their Catholic subjects as a Latin king, to their Greek subjects as a Byzantine emperor, and to their Arabic subjects as an Arab sultan. And so here is another element in the costume. And this has survived from the 12th century. It is quite extraordinary, but you'll hear how it survived in a minute. And then underneath that, they wore this, originally it was purple, this dalmatic, another element in Western, in Catholic ecclesiastical costume. And this expressed the sense that the king wasn't actually a priest king. He wasn't in priestly orders, but his status approached that in many ways of a priest, and he had this particular relationship with God as well as his subjects. So all these pieces, and then the socks, the king's socks with an inscription for the highly honoured, hallowed King William. So this is the next king, known as generally as William the Bad, 1154 to 69, who may be honoured through God, helped through his omnipotence. So an inscription around the top, and again in Arabic. So the people making these inscriptions were, well, they weren't necessarily actually Muslims, because we know that in 1147 to 8, Roger raided the Byzantine Empire and carried away a large number of Jewish silk workers. So it's possible that, but they wouldn't have used the Arab, they'd have spoken Greek. So I suppose it probably is the work of his Arab silk workers. And these two have been preserved. Hold on. Oh. I'm sorry, it jumps a lot. Yeah. So I mentioned that we've got this image of him of Roger being crowned by Christ, but the man who actually built the church for him is this rather sort of strange-looking. He looks a bit like a tortoise, but that's George of Antioch, his admiral, who built this church in honor of the Virgin Mary. St. Mary of the Admiral is the official name of the church. And again, we've got a large Greek inscription. Now, he is typical of the sort of talented people, a great naval commander, and active in all aspects of administration. Among the places that he conquered was the town of Mahdia on the coast of Tunisia, which Roger and his son held for about 12 years, along with a whole line of towns along the coast of what is now Tunisia, places like Sousse and so on. And there was clearly the intention of founding not just a kingdom of Sicily, but we come across this term Kingdom of Africa, by which they didn't mean the whole continent. Obviously, they meant the former Roman province corresponding roughly to Tunisia. So there is Mahdia, and that little spiky thing, those two little spikes there, are said to be from a tower built in the Norman period, but I don't know if that's true. Right, so he also attracted to his court a large number of scholars, and among these scholars, the most important, I think, in many ways, was a man called Idrisi, who came from Ceuta in northern Morocco. Well, now Spain, of course, but across the water from Gibraltar. And Idrisi wrote for King Roger a geography of the world, which some people have argued Roger was interested in the idea of further conquests. He had shown some interest in an expedition to Spain, for instance. That didn't come off. But Idrisi produced, it's not just about the Mediterranean, it's about the much larger world. Now you look at this and you think, this map, world map? No, but wait a moment. Turn it around, because in the tradition in the Islamic world was to put north at the bottom. When you turn it around, you can see quite clearly that this is some sort of world map. I'm very uncertain about the shape of Africa, obviously, but some vaguely recognizable shapes in the Mediterranean. And he's by no means the only scholar at court. We have Greek scholars and so on. So this sense that at the court there was a meeting of a great many scholars from very different backgrounds is an important feature of Norman Sicily. Now, to say it's happening at the court isn't to say that it's happening everywhere. Here are two lovely images. I won't dwell on them, but they do, as examples of the mosaics, these are secular mosaics from the king's private chambers, probably just after the death of Roger II. And these lions and so on, expressing the power of the king. And here's another palace, the Zisa Palace in Palermo. Now, what we're actually looking at is, as I say, something of a divide between the sort of collaboration which occurred at the royal court and the situation in the countryside. We know, for instance, that within a few years of Roger's death in 1154, there were pogroms that broke out against the Muslim population in eastern Sicily. And I'll just quote a little bit from what a court chronicler wrote about this. This is the so-called Lombards, whom I mentioned earlier, made unprovoked attacks in nearby places and massacred both those who lived alongside Christians in various towns as well as those who owned their own estates. They made no distinction of sex or age. The number of that community who died is not easy to reckon. The few who experienced a better fate fled to less dangerous towns, and then it goes on to say they never wanted to go back to the parts of Sicily they came from. So things have clearly turned rather bad in the countryside. There were these intense rivalries which were getting in the way of the creation of a sort of peaceful society, even though the government in Palermo, if you compare it to almost any other government in Europe in the 12th century, you could compare it, let's say, to England. Two kingdoms, Norman England and Norman Sicily, very tight rule, very strong centralization, but Sicily even more so. So the fact that it broke down in the 1160s is an alarming testimony to the fact that even so, the coexistence of these different ethnic and religious groups was proving very fragile. Right, so I'm going to try and move on because I am really miscalculating the time, I think. Hold on. One of the signs that things are changing is a great cathedral which was founded first as a monastery and then turned into a cathedral just outside Palermo, a place called Monreale. And here we have King William II, William the Good. So he's wearing the same sort of costume as we saw Roger II, his grandfather, wearing. And he's presenting his church to the Virgin Mary. But he is actually a keen advocate of Latinization. We begin to see more and more pressure on the Muslim population to convert, and he handed over large areas of western Sicily to the church so that they could push on with this work. And we have evidence, if you look at personal names in the documents, you find names like Nicholas and so on turning up among the Muslim peasants, clearly an indication that people are converting to Christianity. So by the 1180s or so, the answer to these tensions in the countryside, seen from the royal court, was to make people convert. This is the inside of this extraordinary basilica at Monreale. And this time, the mosaics, they're in the Byzantine style, but the people who made the mosaics appear to have been Sicilians themselves. So they've copied, they've learned the art of mosaics. The outside has some sort of reminiscence, perhaps, of the Islamic past. I mean, you might consider these arches evidence that something had survived of that Islamic past. Though, as I say, you have to get away from the idea that that has any religious connotations. They may simply have thought this was a very beautiful design, and in many ways it is. Well, William at his court, despite this process of Latinization, he did still maintain a mixed court. We have descriptions of it. A traveller from Granada, a Muslim from Granada, actually wrote about visiting the court because he was somebody of quite high status, so he was received there. And he met some of the high officials who were Muslims, but he says, he spoke to one of them who said, oh, well, it's okay for you, you come from Granada, which is, you know, it was a Muslim state. He says, you can boldly display your faith in Islam and are successful in your enterprises and thrive by God's will in your commerce, but we must conceal our faith and, fearful of our lives, must adhere to the worship of God and the discharge of our religious duties in secret. So there was a sense in which, at least outwardly, and this had been going on for some time, they were expected to convert to Christianity. But here we seem to see a rather more mixed scenario with Achim the physician. You can see him trying to cure King William the Good, who's on his deathbed actually. And you can see the astrologer, who appears to be a Muslim. He's got an astrolabe or something, and he's been brought in. It was still a mixed court. There were Greeks at court and so on, but the emphasis was all pushing towards this process of Latinization. And this was accentuated after the death of King William by a struggle for the throne in which the daughter of King Roger II was involved. Her name was Constance, and this is a sort of cap or crown, very much in the Byzantine mold with these pendants. That was typical of Byzantine crowns. It's not really a crown, actually, as I say. It's quite made of soft material. But this was found in her tomb, and she managed to with her husband, who was the German Emperor Henry VI. This is where it becomes complicated. They managed to take control of Sicily. Henry was a tough guy. He put to death his enemies in rather ghastly ways. Constance didn't like that. She really wanted to restore the old sort of centralized system of Norman government. But it would all depend on having a successor. And she did have a successor. She had an heir, the future Emperor Frederick II. Now, Frederick II, brought up in Palermo, though for the rest of his life, once he had gone off, not just as King of Sicily, but to claim the crown of Germany, which is how he became emperor, he rather lost touch with the island. His favorite parts of the Kingdom of Sicily were on the mainland, in Puglia, and also in Naples itself. But I'll come back to Puglia in a minute. Here is Frederick II, the author of an extraordinary book on the art of hunting with birds. And he was something of a, it's not just a book about hunting, it's a book about biology, actually. Tremendously well informed about all sorts of different types of bird. Famous manuscript in the Vatican. This is actually a later emperor, but this is how Frederick would probably have looked, roughly, when he was arrayed as emperor or indeed king of Sicily. Because what happened, and this explains the survival of those robes that I showed you earlier, what happened was that Emperor Henry VI, having conquered Sicily, took back to Germany the Sicilian coronation robes. So if we want to get some sort of idea of what they looked like, this is as good. This is an image from the 16th century. It's as good an image as we can hope to have. He's wearing the cape. You can just see the edge of that. And underneath his stole, he's got the tunic and dalmatic. And the shoes, you can see the shoes as well, which I will come to in a minute. There's the cape. And if I can get the shoes up. Oh, the gloves made for Frederick II. So the silk workshop was still active, doing this sort of thing. And then these shoes, which decorated with pearls and so on, again made for the emperor, into which those socks that you saw earlier would somehow fit. I mean, somehow, anyway. I don't know what happened if subsequent emperors had large feet or whatever, but anyway, this was how it all worked. Now, Frederick II, therefore, as emperor, we're looking at a different category of existence, if you like, because clearly he had concerns which extended far beyond the Kingdom of Sicily, where he imposed a very tough regime, intolerant of dissent, lots of royal monopolies over salt and things like this. He sort of raked in the money, very good deals selling his grain to the Tunisians. He was very alert to the need to make money, partly because he ended up fighting a lot of wars against enemies in northern Italy, and sometimes against the popes as well, who were very worried at the danger that the ruler of southern Italy and Germany, who also had territorial claims in northern Italy, would simply swallow up the whole peninsula. So it was a very tense period in which Frederick found it difficult really to maintain the sort of courtly life we hear about in the books. You'll read about the court of Frederick II in Palermo. It's complete nonsense. There wasn't such a thing. He was traveling all the time. The court traveled with him. And there was one important difference. The Muslims were absent. He did find ways of tapping into the culture of the Islamic world by associating himself very much with Jewish scholars, including scholars from Spain. But that was how he got hold of translations and things like that of key works. But what had happened then to the Muslims? Well, during the period of his mother and father's takeover of the island, and then subsequently going on really for a couple of decades, in western Sicily, on the lands of the Cathedral of Monreale, which I showed you earlier, there was a constant rebellion going on in the hinterland, a violent rebellion against royal authority. And by the 1220s, he was managing to get the upper hand. He was now a young man, aged 25, 26, and beginning to impose his rule. And he dealt with the Muslim population that still survived. Quite a lot had actually emigrated, even in the late 12th century. But he dealt with them by deporting them en masse to Puglia, to a town called Lucera in the north of Puglia, where he cleared out the Christian population and established this Sicilian Muslim city on mainland Italian soil. And he used the Muslim soldiers as his personal bodyguard, built a palace there. It's an extraordinary story, actually, that he dealt with them that way and somehow seems to have managed to retain the loyalty of at least some of them. He was very conscious, even as King of Sicily, that he had a higher status than just being a king. And we find him beginning to mint in 1231, he began to, along with some very elaborate legislation which repeated a lot of the already elaborate legislation of the Norman kings, but along with this, he minted these gold coins, high quality gold coins. I mean, they are minute, so this is enlarged out of all proportion. But here he is portrayed in a different light. We've seen how the kings of Sicily might portray themselves as Byzantine emperors, as Arab rulers, and so on. But here we have him as an ancient Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus, Imperator Fredericus, and a portrait of him wearing the sort of wreath that an ancient Roman emperor would have worn, the eagle as a sort of symbol of imperial power. And this, interestingly, although, as I say, as emperor, he was really sort of ruler of Germany and northern Italy, this coinage was actually made for Sicily and southern Italy for the Kingdom of Sicily. And it's another tribute to the fact that the island of Sicily, with its tremendous resources in grain and other goods, was able to still to make these massive profits out of the international grain trade and so on. And more of it, the emperor was trying to channel towards his own treasury. As I say, the problem was that fighting so many wars, his treasury emptied as soon as it filled up, if you see what I mean. Well, I think the sight of the King of Sicily as Roman emperor is a good place on which to conclude. Thank you very much.
So, as always, we have time for a few questions, and I have a couple of questions myself, if I may. Well, first of all, David, thank you so much for your talk. It was a really enlightening lecture that really gave us a sense of the golden age that Norman Sicily witnessed. My question was, I had in the back of my mind, as you talked about the Normans arriving in Sicily, I was thinking about the Catalans settling in Majorca a couple hundred years after. So I have a double question. I was thinking about, well, is there any parallel between the way these two conquers or settlements happened, and also more in general, can you say anything about the links between the two islands?
Well, I'll begin with the links between the two islands because, I mean, there wasn't time to say as much as I would have liked to have said about this. King William II, whom I showed, donating Monreale to the Virgin Mary, he had the most amazingly ambitious plans which went beyond anything Roger II had planned. He planned an attack on Alexandria. He actually did attack Alexandria. He captured Thessalonica in Greece, and so it went on. But he also, in 1182, he planned an attack on Majorca. Now, what was he trying to do? We don't know, really. It's not very well documented. But you get the sense that the kings of Sicily, he was reviving the sorts of plans his grandfather had indulged in, which involved the building of a Mediterranean empire. The comparison between what happened here in 1229 and what happened in the 1060s onwards, I think it is a rather different scenario, isn't it? Because in the case of Sicily, you've got these deals with, there's the ruler of Catania who's prepared to do a deal with Roger II's father, Roger I, and sort of invite him in, and really doesn't see that the result is going to be that the Normans take over. Whereas here we're looking at an act of conquest, a massive fleet coming in, so the naval dimension is extremely important. I mean, obviously, they had to get ships across. Roger I had to get ships across to Sicily, which was a challenge, but he managed to do that. So I think the whole way in which it's conducted is different. But then the aftermath. Now, it seems to me there's quite a bit of uncertainty in the case of Majorca about what happened to the Muslim population. I get the impression that those who say they were all enslaved or all departed or whatever are exaggerating. It's clear that there were still Muslims on the island after the conquest. But on the other hand, the repopulation was carried on at a fantastic rate, so that Ciutat de Mallorca became a great flourishing centre of trade within just a few years. Once again, I mean, it had been under the Muslims, but the Catalans turned it into a second Barcelona. It's quite extraordinary in such a short period of time. So again, something very different happening there with very substantial repopulation, which in the case of Sicily was a much slower process, which was still going on under Frederick II. When he got rid of the Muslim population, there were still these people coming from northern Italy and coming to settle in the south. And what's really interesting is that experts on language, on dialects, looking at Italian dialects in Sicily in recent times, whether it's still the case, you know, things have changed probably in the last 50 years, but if you went back just 50, 60 years ago, they could identify in the dialects of Italian spoken around Mount Etna aspects which went back to the Lombard settlers from Liguria, from the area to the west of Genoa. So it looks as if that was one of the major sources of repopulation. I mentioned also the Genoese, the Venetians, and so on. So it's a very interesting contrast between the suddenness of what happened here and the very gradual nature of what happened in Sicily.
I have another question, if you allow me. The last important ruler that you mentioned in your talk, Frederick II, I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about his nickname of Stupor Mundi, or the astonishment of the world. Where did this come from, and what do you think about it?
Well, it comes from a chronicle written in England and actually preserved in one of the colleges in my university. Matthew Paris, who was a great chronicler and who was, I think the best word is a gossip. I mean, he was somebody who liked a good story. He was obviously fascinated by Frederick, and he was also amazed by what he could see happening on the political front. And I think that may be more the explanation than Frederick's cultural interests, which were, I think, you know, in many ways quite remarkable. But it's the sense that here was a man who was prepared to keep challenging the papacy, who had the sort of, I mean, it's the sort of political courage of Frederick, perhaps, that underlies that. In terms of, if you look at the historians writing in subsequent centuries about Frederick, of course, they became very much attached to that label. When I wrote my book on Frederick II, it actually has the subtitle, A Medieval Emperor. So I was trying to argue that he was much more a man of his time than people had realized. And that includes his cultural patronage, because there were other kings, particularly around the Mediterranean, who were also avid patrons of culture. You think of Alfonso X of Castile, you think of some of the kings of Aragon, you think of some of the rulers of the Crusader kingdom and so on, and obviously the Byzantine emperors. So I think people have tended to exaggerate that side of his life, partly by taking him out of context. There was a very prominent German historian who wrote a very influential biography in 1927, which started on the day of his birth, and you had no sense of the Norman background, and that in many ways what Frederick was doing was a continuation of what particularly his grandfather Roger II had been doing. I think the real Stupor Mundi perhaps is Roger II.
So if you have any questions, please use the microphone. Si tienen preguntas en español pueden hablar despacito y si no yo intento traducirlas, pero por favor usen el micrófono.
Good evening. Thank you for this lecture. I want to point only two things. First of them, especially for the English speakers, I want to say Ceuta is not Morocco. Never was Morocco, not yet, at least. And the second one is there is a very important Arab community, was important Arab community, wasn't Muslim, was Christian. And I think this is something.
Sorry, what?
The thing I want to say is because you are Arab speaker doesn't mean you are Muslim.
You're making some important points. I agree with you that Ceuta is, I've been to Ceuta a couple of times, and I'm not suggesting it is politically part of Morocco. I mean, geographically it's part of North Africa, if you like, but yeah, I don't have any problem with that. And being British, I'm aware that, you know, the Strait of Gibraltar, it's a very sensitive area, but I think that preserving Ceuta as what it is, as a multicultural, it's interesting, it is a multicultural city in which Christians, Jews and Muslims, yeah. But, sorry, the use of Arabic speaking, well, there's a very interesting aspect to this, which is the island of Malta, where, which was part of the medieval kingdom of Sicily, and where the language which is still spoken by a Christian population is actually medieval Sicilian Arabic with a lot of Italian and English words accumulated over the centuries. So yes, I mean, that's absolutely right, yep.
Yeah, thank you for your lecture. My question relates to Peter the Great, Peter III, yeah, the son of James I, the Conqueror, the King of Aragon, and the marriage of him with Constance II, yeah, if I'm not wrong, yeah. But the question relates to the cause or the origin of that marriage, because after listening to several historians here in Palma, and after having read your book, The War of 200 Years, you mentioned that the reason why of this marriage it was the La Vespri Siciliani, yeah, and trying to get help from Aragon against the French and Carlos d'Anjou, whereas here, after listening to some historians, they do not relate the Vespri Siciliani with the marriage of Costanza and Peter the Great. It was just a simple arrangement, but not because of the Vespri Siciliani. So maybe you can explain even further.
I mean, one has to understand with the Sicilian Vespers that the intention of the rebels against King Charles of Anjou was not to bring in King Peter of Aragon. They wanted to establish a group of independent republics like the North Italian cities, from which quite a significant part of the population came, because, as I said, there was this process of migration from the north. The Pope was dead against that. He was not willing to let that happen. And Peter was waiting in North Africa, supposedly on crusade. He clearly knew something was likely to happen, but not quite what. And so he was then invited. He moved in very quickly. I see Peter, that whole issue, it's very much part of a long history which was already been going on for several decades, of this rivalry between the House of Aragon and the House of Anjou. And it was happening all over the place. It happened in Provence, where the Aragonese had had a presence. They'd had Aragonese Counts of Provence. They lost control of that, and Charles of Anjou became Count of Provence. There were disputes over other territories, over Sardinia, which was all a bit unrealistic, and so on. So, and also in North Africa, Charles of Anjou going on crusade to Tunis with his brother, King Louis IX of France, St. Louis. So, as I see it, it's part of a whole complex of Aragonese, I suppose, anxieties, if you like, about the increasing power of the rulers of Sicily, the Angevin rulers of Sicily, which was a block to Catalan Aragonese ambitions. Now, then the question is, no time to deal with this now, but to what extent the Catalan merchants were involved in this, because by 1282, by the time of the rebellion, they were trading intensively in Sicily in grain when they could. So did they influence the king? And it seems to me that that's an area where, I don't know, I'm a bit skeptical. I think the dynastic issue that Peter was that his wife was a member or was a descendant of Frederick II. This was the crucial issue, that her grandfather had been, and her father had been king of Sicily.
We don't have any more questions. David, thank you very much again. It was a pleasure to have you here. And one more question? Sorry. Sí.
Disculpe, he querido entender que la leyenda de Stupor Mundi, la leyenda que posteriormente tenemos de Federico como pues un ser un poco excepcional desde la leyenda a leyenda realidad del parto en público, que hablaba 5 o 6 idiomas en una época en que muchos reyes prácticamente no sabían leer, que por una parte le consideraban un gobernante excepcional con un destino brillante y por otro lado el anticristo, el verdadero anticristo. Entonces, ¿todo esto es una construcción posterior o hay algo en esta imagen de Federico que ya en su momento tenía una parte del entorno, de la cristiandad?
I didn't get it all.
How much of the Stupor Mundi legend originated at the time, and how much is a later development?
Yeah, I mean, Matthew Paris was writing at the time. I suppose the question is how many people read what he wrote, because it was written in manuscript, and what we have is actually written in his own hands, so it's not as if we have evidence that it was being widely copied. And yes, it's a good question how it was passed on. I think the word you used, anticristo, is very germane, because that was precisely the language that was appearing in some of the papal letters, for instance. The popes, particularly towards the end of Frederick's life, the popes and the cardinals were writing in these almost apocalyptic terms about the struggle with Frederick II. And so it's already clear that in his own lifetime he has to struggle with this very bad reputation. And then that was sort of perpetuated by the political struggles in the Italian cities, where we have these two great factions, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Ghibellines being pro-imperial generally, and the Guelphs being pro-papal generally. And so you get this sort of sense that the Ghibellines are celebrating the inheritance of Frederick II, and the other side insisting on being the true defenders of Catholicism and so on. But it would be interesting, somebody, I think possibly somebody in Italy has tried to do this, a book not about Frederick but about his reputation over the centuries. And then it was very much revived in the early 20th century when this German historian Ernst Kantorowicz, when he wrote this biography, 27. I didn't give his name because the translation wouldn't be able to cope, probably cannot cope at the moment, with the name Kantorowicz. He sees him as, you know, a great leader who will redeem Germany, and who, on the other hand, also in Sicily has this sort of extraordinary ability to knit his territories together, to impose his will. And you can see why Kantorowicz's book was translated, was read with great interest by Goebbels and Hitler and so on. So Frederick's reputation at that point reached a new, I wouldn't say high point, but new intensity. I would say new intensity.
His profile was not unprecedented, as you said. He had an illustrious grandfather. So now, indeed, thank you very much. Muchas gracias a David por haber vuelto a Palma. Démosle las gracias, por favor.
The translation was good. I hope it worked. Did it? Well, people can tell me afterwards.
Muchas gracias.
Pues